At the height of their power, they would rival Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. Fighting in great wars whose details have been lost to the sands of time, the Egyptians would then call them brothers. The daughters of the horse lords of the Mitanni would bear Egyptian royal children, and after a violent collapse, their very existence would be forgotten for more than 3,000 years. The Mitanni were a society built around a king with broad authoritarian power, and his chariot warrior aristocracy. Among their innovations, the perfection and likely invention of the spoke-wheeled chariot and scale armor, which would shape the future of warfare for over the next 1,000 years. At the height of their power, that would last for roughly 150 years, the Mitanni controlled a vast territory, situated between the ancient and culturally influential power of Babylon to the southeast, the aggressive and warlike Hittite Empire to the northwest, and ancient Egypt at the height of its imperial power to the south. Controlling all the major land routes between these great empires meant that trade was the lifeblood and source of fantastic wealth for the Mitanni. However, their vast borders and precarious position between these great powers meant that the Mitanni had not only to be adept at warfare, but diplomacy as well. The Mitanni Empire was primarily comprised of Hurrian-speaking people, who had migrated into northern Mesopotamia, becoming the dominant population there, hundreds of years before the rise of the Mitanni Empire, forming a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms that perhaps fought each other as often as their neighbors. Their squabbling would come to an abrupt end when the Hittite king Morsili shocked the Bronze Age world when his army, in an unprecedented march, followed the Euphrates River, paving a swath of destruction as he went, culminating in the sack of Babylon, destroying their palaces, temples, and taking their royal family and gods as hostages back to the Hittite capital of Hattusa. A mini dark age ensued in Mesopotamia after this, where little to no surviving records elucidate this period. A little less than 100 years later, the kingdom of Mitanni was well established, formed likely very soon after Morsili's sack of Babylon, out of a confederation of Hurrian states. Very little besides the names of Mitanni's early kings are known of this period, and dates are very uncertain. Around 1550 BC, a Hittite text makes the first brief reference to a Mitanni state, and in 1500, Pharaoh Thutmose I makes the first Egyptian reference to them after crossing the Euphrates River and campaigning in their territory. The first and perhaps greatest of Mitanni's kings we know a little of, Shaushtatar, is believed to have beaten the Egyptians further south and conquered Assyria, taking the gods from their temples and the gold and silver doors off their hinges to be used at his royal palace in the Mitanni capital of Washukanni. Troops were stationed throughout Assyria to guarantee its loyalty. Shaushtatar's image was so impactful that during the reign of his successors, his royal seal and name were often used instead of their own. The Mitanni state developed a well-organized military with the king at its head. Beneath him were client kings, who referred to him as father and he to them as sons. Other districts were governed by appointed bureaucratic administrators, each having its own fortified capital city and a fortified armory and state-run manufactories where militia and professional soldiers could take their damaged equipment to be replaced. Even small towns and mayors' houses in the countryside were fortified structures, with local militia units maintained to man them. The centerpiece of the Mitanni army was the Nakhashu, professional military men bound by oath directly to the king. The Marianu were the elite core of the army, who controlled sprawling estates where horses were raised and trained for war. The Mitanni were the acknowledged masters of horses and chariotry of their day, as is evidenced by a surviving Hittite text, where Kikkuli, a Mitanni horse trainer, over several tablets describes in great detail the proper conditioning of a war horse over a 214-day period. Utilizing interval training that has only been reintroduced into equestrian training in the last 30 years. Scale and lamellar armor also appears to be an innovation of the Hurrians, as is evidenced by all other people in the Near East using words derived from the Hurrian term for scale mail to describe armor. After nearly a century of recurrent war, with one side gaining the upper hand and then the other, the Egyptians and Mitanni negotiated a peace, and more or less permanent borders between their two nations. After proposing on 7 different occasions, the daughter of the Mitanni king was sent to Egypt to marry the pharaoh Thutmose IV. To the Mitanni and in Mesopotamian culture, it was more prestigious to be the father-in-law of another king, and to the Egyptians, it was more prestigious to have many foreign wives. Both empires made a mutual protection pact against the Hittites and referred to each other as beloved brother in their correspondence, sending each other lavish gifts. Over the next few generations, the pharaohs and Mitanni great kings would repeat this process. The Mitanni great king Shuttarna II traveled the 1,300 miles between their two empires' capitals, and was received at the Egyptian court in what truly must have been a memorable spectacle. There is even a theory that Nefertiti had been a Mitannian princess. The Near Eastern empires were peaceful and prosperous for a time. The beginning of the end began with the murder of the Mitanni king. The younger brother of the murdered king, still a child, was placed on the throne as a puppet ruler, and all diplomatic relations with Egypt were cut off, possibly to avoid Egyptian retaliation, as the murderer may have been a Hittite or Assyrian agent. The young king Tushratta bided his time and eventually executed all the assassins, and then fought off a Hittite invasion. His first priority was to reopen relations with Egypt, recounting his tribulations, and he negotiated another marriage, and lavish gifts were once again exchanged. However, at the Mitanni court, two factions emerged. A pro-Hittite faction, led by the king's brothers, and a pro-Assyrian faction, led by his sons. The greatest conqueror of all the Hittite kings, suppiluliuma, waged campaign after successful campaign, to the east and against the Mitanni. He was aided by Tushratta's brother, who he installed as a puppet king. Taking advantage of the family infighting, Assyria became independent without a fight. Tushratta was then murdered by one of his sons. Suppiluliuma invaded the Mitanni heartland, installing Tushratta's brother, who had fled to his court and had become his son-in-law, on the throne of Mitanni. Although the Mitanni undoubtedly petitioned the Egyptians for aid, these events coincided with the turbulent reigns and internal strife of pharaohs Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, although it does seem to have been in both the Hittites and Babylonians' interest to keep a Mitanni state alive, as they both feared the rise of the warlike Assyrians. The region would become a battleground for the Hittites and Assyrians. In 1290 BC, the Assyrian king Adad-nirari destroyed the Mitanni capital of Washukanni, burning it to the ground, deporting its population, and making slaves out of the royal family that had once been their masters. Over the next 100 years, the Assyrians completely obliterated the memory of the Mitanni. It would not be until the late 19th century, over 3,000 years later, that fragments of the names and deeds of the Mitanni were made known to mankind once again. This has been Epimetheus. Let me know in the comments, what empire do you believe is the greatest, that most have not heard of, or just what less prominent empire is your favorite and why. Also, don't forget to hit the bell icon and get notifications every time I make a new video.